There's a lot of narrative that, Spotify has destroyed or is destroying the music industry, and I want to kind of push back against that a little bit by taking a more historical perspective because we can look at everything through the lens of today and just say, well, this isn't right, and maybe you agree or maybe you disagree. That's not really relevant. What I do want to do is give you a little bit of insight on at least how I think we got here. So that's going to be jumping around all over the place, but predominantly we're talking around the year 2000 or so, before and after that, and just talk about how attitudes kind of shifted and what was happening before then, and then hopefully this isn't completely scatterbrained. This is unscripted, and hopefully it's not a too long video. It's probably not going to be 20 minutes, but it's probably going to be longer than my usual 4-minute stuff, right? So let's go back to 1999, whenever Napster came along, and we have to talk about what the world was really like at that time, because normally this really gets buried in the so-called tech boom, or dot-com boom rather, and there's a lot of truth to that, but I think the real numbers was something like 10% of Americans were able to get on the internet or had access to the internet. And mind you, we're talking about a very different internet. We're not talking about you were on your phone or everybody had a laptop. It was everybody had a desktop for the most part, and we're talking about dial-up. And we're talking about the more wealthy types would have, like, say, DSL, but that was very hard to get because you needed certain kind of data ports to get that to work, very much like what you see with your Wi-Fi connectors today. But that infrastructure just didn't really exist back then. Computers are very expensive. A lot of people didn't have computers, and people were just on like really these big bricks of phones. They like flip phones were just starting to come around, much less talking about smartphones. And of course, internet, if you actually had it, was extremely expensive, but the main thing is that it was slow. And before that, there was something called torrents that came along and that allowed like files to be broken up and sent to a computer. And when Napster came out, it was a peer-to-peer file sharing. Now, they did not start this by any measure. There was places that were open before them that had it, but they were like the first big one. They were the first ones to really like make the news and that everybody kind of knew about. So what a lot of people actually did back then, instead of really sharing it so much, they would burn it to like a CD with a burner. And these things sucked. I mean, maybe half of them were no good, and then, they would have to reburn it, and that was definitely not legal by any measure of the word, but that's really how this whole thing kind of spread, that it gave access to a lot of music that was simply not available anywhere. There were a lot of leaks, which we will get into. And one of the big attractions is that you could find independent music, or you could find, like, say, music from an artist that was big at that point, but what did they sound like before they were signed? And there's a lot of music that was available back then that you cannot find to this day. But before I go forward, I want to go backwards a little bit. And we always talk about these record breaking album sales like the Eagles or Dark Side of the Moon. And you say, well, why did that actually happen? Was it because the music was just significantly better than anything that ever came after it? I mean, yeah, people are going to make that argument. But the reality was that there was a new format coming out every 10 years. When those albums were first released, it was mainly records. Then there was 8-tracks, which kind of bombed. Then there was tapes. And then there was CDs. And all these formats had all of their problems. I mean, records, they sounded fine, but they were easily broken. They were easily scratched, so once it broke, you had to buy it again. Tapes, I will hopefully find an image for you to see what that's about. And then CDs, well, you had the problem with them getting scratched very easily. If you dropped it, you broke it. There was CD rot. And, the whole thing was every 10 years, they want $10 more or $20 more for these 12 songs, and then it breaks, and you have to rebuy it all the time. I mean, a large collection of music at that time might have been like 50 CDs or 50 records. There was very few people that had massive amounts of records that you might see, and definitely we didn't have the access to the amount of music that we have today. and everything was sort of dependent on radio. And that really just kind of sets up what was happening around the year 2000. That, here we are again. Oh my goodness, there's another friggin' format, but this time it's digitals. MP3 is very low quality. It doesn't sound that good, but, it's good enough for the kids, right? But, the adults in the room, if you will, they're like, yeah, I want to be responsible and pay for music. I don't want to steal music. And a lot of people won't admit this part, but I'm going to tell it to you like this. At that time, the record labels pretended to have a big problem with Napster, but they really didn't. Every single time there was an album that was about to come out, about a week before, there was a leak, and the narrative as well was the guy sweeping the floor. Like, no. Are you kidding me? Like, these places are locked down like fortresses, and there's no way that they're going to be able to steal from the producer or the mixing engineer and put it to the mastering and then print it out into it's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous that was actually happening. These leaks were definitely being done by the record labels, I believe. But it wasn't a really big problem at the time because every time there was a leak, that was free advertising. Yeah, sure, the people that weren't going to pay for it got it, but there was a lot of people that were going to pay for it that just got it early anyways. And record sales actually increased quite a bit, in the early 2000s until about 2003 or so. So as we get into the early 2000s, record labels are starting to increase and all this stuff is starting to really impact the record labels at this point. And they really started going after, the users instead of the companies. And this was a big problem, right? If you're going to sue somebody and say 85-year-old grandmother, you're going to get everybody turned away from you. And that's the thing I don't think that the record labels really understood. Well, I don't know if the record labels really had a problem with it so much as the RIAA, but the RIAA definitely killed anybody wanted to buy music ever again because now it's a moral, ethical problem. And you can't be suing 14-year-old kids. You can't be suing, all the end users. So that was just like, people are like, you know what, I'm just going to steal it now. Like, even people that were like, I would never ever steal music or do these free downloads were just like, yeah, you know what, actually, I did. I bought Dark Side of the Moon 17 times in the past 30 years. I'm not going to give them any more money if they're just going to use it to sue children. So now they've lost the most important part of this whole war, if you will. It's the moral war. And, so now there had to be alternatives. And along came iTunes. And iTunes was hailed as something that's just absolutely going to save the music industry. And it kind of did anyways, at least with their 99-cent downloads. And they also had, like, say, lossless formats, if you will, if you wanted to pay a little bit more for it. But I think the default was like a real low quality 128 MP3 or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't really have these things back then, but as far as I remember, if somebody knows, just leave it in the comments. So after Napster got sued to oblivion, they actually became a streaming service. They're one of the first ones. I don't know the first or second or last of any of these things. I can only really talk about the major endpoints, right? Because everything existed before. So they had to have alternative means of distributing music. They already had the iPod, but then there was also going to be, like, say, radio. And there was a lot of problems with internet radio. It was just kind of coming up. There was like Last FM, and then Pandora came out, and there was all these other apps that were coming out, at least in the early smartphone days. And, and then, before there were smartphones, we're talking about the BlackBerry days or the Razor days, the internet connected phone was actually starting to become a thing, and it was just starting to barely become affordable at that time. I mean, even at that time, text messages were like 25 cents a text. It was something ridiculous. Nobody could afford to text at the time. I mean, they could, but my goodness, So now all these apps are coming out, and the biggest one that really came out that became like a on-demand streaming service, like what we see with Spotify, was called Rhapsody. But I believe that was only a desktop app at the time. I mean, I had it, and I remember it being a desktop app. I don't know if they had a web app, but this probably makes more logical sense because there wasn't a lot of web apps at the time. Everything was downloaded onto your phone or to your computer. But the fact is that Rhapsody was the first one to really do that. And I think they charged like $10 a month, and you could just pick whatever song you wanted to listen to, provided that it was available. Just like the same thing as Spotify. So now record sales are gone, and the iPod and things like that are, still popular, but the iTunes thing isn't really as popular as people would like it to be. There's internet radio that's not doing that hot, but it's doing good enough. Terrestrial radio is not doing very good at all. That's starting to fall apart. And then we basically just have what at this point, right? We just have Rhapsody. And then along came the iPhone, which finally allowed people to have internet in their pocket. And it was cheap enough that you could actually use it. And shortly after that, there was kind of a push to get people off of like using laptops and things like that. It was called the post-PC age, or what they were preparing for. And then, along came tablets, and of course more smartphones like Androids. And a lot of these app makers were getting very good incentive to actually build apps for all these platforms. And of course, well, what do people want? Well, they want music. You think Spotify was the only one that came out at that time? Like, no, there were so many of them, but it was just the one that ended up lasting the longest and really existing for the longest, and really from the backing of support from the various record labels. And during that time, we also had YouTube, which was just starting to come out, and, people obviously wanted to share more music, and they were making all these different videos to the music, and then the music industry stepped in, and they were pretty much going to sue YouTube out of existence. And that's how Google and everything like that ended up buying them for an obscene amount of money. Google actually negotiated everything so that people can continue to stream their covers and other things like that, but obviously, and that's why we live in this world today where, copyright owners are allowed to do takedown orders on YouTube. So now the record labels are backing the streaming from YouTube and Spotify, Pandora, and all these other apps and things like that, and they're okay with it. Kind of ask yourself, well, how did that actually destroy the music industry? In my opinion, it really just sounds like that the population pushed a route, and the music industry reacted. They reacted very slowly, really trying to keep a grip on, what they were gonna, the money that they were earning. But there was no plan here. There was nothing that, Spotify was the designated killer of music. That was not how it worked at all. If Spotify didn't exist today, people would just be file sharing. And, we would be forced to give our music away for free, or at least try to get our stuff on a terrestrial radio or whatever it is like that. We wouldn't have these distribution services to get our stuff out. Maybe we'd get lucky and get a big hit on YouTube, but we really can't say on the lens of history and looking at today and saying, everything needs to stop now. This is how everything got destroyed. There's a big backstory of how everything happened.